Welcome everybody. I'm Zahara Jade, and this is the first session on collective trauma, a somatic and embodied approach to healing in current times. During this first session, we are going to talk about what trauma is, what it does to us, how it affects us, and the outcomes of experiencing trauma, how it relates to long-term chronic illness, pain. Then in the second session, we are going to actually take part in a somatic journey and heal trauma. Currently, we're all connected to an experience of collective trauma, and I'll be speaking more about what I mean by that in a little while. So thanks to all for being here, and here we go. As I mentioned, I'm Zahara Jade. I have a master's in clinical psychology. It was kind of like the only thing I knew that I wanted to do when I left college. I got in a PhD program and I was halfway through and I was really sick. I've had a very debilitating autoimmune disease since I was born, basically. I grew up very, very sick, in and out of hospitals, being dragged across the country, seeing different doctors and specialists. Nobody really knew what I had. They just knew I had some sort of autoimmune disease. They diagnosed me with different types of them, familial Mediterranean fever, juvenile rheumatoid arthritis, put a label on this, give some drugs here. I was in the hospital for this and that, on a lot of different medications. When I was 10 years old, I was put in the hospital on massive doses of steroids. I was taken off all foods because my stomach was impacted by the disease. I couldn't eat. I was given what's called a Broviac in one of my main arteries and fed through a tube for about 6 or 8 months. And it really changed who I was and what I thought my story was. I became pretty identified with the chronic illness, and it definitely affected my body image and how I interacted with food. I didn't develop a full-blown eating disorder, luckily, but it definitely impacted me. It's pretty traumatizing going through that type of experience, and we'll talk a little bit about just like medical trauma. When I got to grad school, I was still very sick and still having trouble with some of the symptoms, which had evolved by then. They left my intestines and they entered different parts of my body. So I get ulcers in all different areas, and this being a female wellness session, I can talk about it. The ulcers entered my female parts. I couldn't walk for weeks. And I was in grad school seeing patients, and I realized it was probably not the best fit for me at that time. And I was alone and pretty far from home and far from my partner at the time. And I decided to take a break from grad school, which was a pretty big decision and probably the best decision I ever made. So I left my PhD program. Luckily, I had terminated at a master's. And it changed the trajectory of my life because a couple of years later, when I was still very sick, I was working at the time, I found a healer to work with. At that point, I was 25. I was getting sick every month. And that was sort of the history of my disease. Every month for about a week, I would spike a very high fever, get these ulcers, my joints would be inflamed. Nothing would really control it. I was on 15 medications at the time and very depressed, very sick. Nothing was helping. And I went to my doctor and I said, please, something has to give. This isn't working. Nothing's working. Do you have any recommendations? He gave me 2 cards. He gave me the card of this social worker and the card of this other lady. And he says, I don't know what she does, but she heals people who have cancer. And I thought, wow, that's pretty crazy, but let me see what she does. And this is how I started down the path of getting help and healing. And I didn't know it at the time, but she worked with getting to the root of chronic disease and chronic illness and healing it and really catalyzing it. After a month, my inflammation started to go down. And within 6 months, I was really a lot better. And within a year, I was in remission. And 2 years later, I left to travel the world. So that's a little bit about my story and my background. I had a master's degree. I didn't know what I would do with it. I didn't foresee my future being what it is now, but I ended up becoming a yoga instructor and teaching overseas. I taught mindfulness practices. I taught yoga in Vietnam. I taught in Bali. I taught in Thailand while I built an eco-spiritual business. And I also studied yoga in Mysore in India, and I studied somatic therapy and somatic healing practices, as well as other alternative healing. I tried different alternative healing practices with just about every type of practitioner you can imagine. And ultimately, I came back to what I found really helped me. And that's why I've developed the Truth Catalyst method. Through all of my research, it's come down to getting to the root of what causes chronic illness, chronic pain, and emotional distress, as well as spiritual distress. And ultimately, that's why we're talking today about trauma. I'd like to start out with a little story. Even with all of my travel and all of my journeying and all of my healing, I'm still susceptible to experiencing trauma. I had met my husband, my soulmate, while I was living in Chiang Mai. And we moved back to America, and we were living in Santa Barbara. He was on a business trip, and he was gone during the Thomas Fire. So I was there alone with my dog. I was able to live. I didn't have to evacuate. But all of my friends, everybody I knew evacuated during the Thomas Fire. And the sky's just filled with this dark, gray, yellowish smoke. So at that time, everybody, if you walked outside, you had to wear a mask if you wanted to even remotely breathe, which is what I did. So you didn't really see people's faces. Everything was pretty somber at the time. This went on for a few weeks, but I packed a go bag. Every night I was ready to go. I was reading the news. I was preparing myself to get just our important things in the car and leave in case the fire got closer. I was able to see the fire from far away. And it was pretty terrifying for me. I didn't have any support system there at the time. We had just actually moved back to Santa Barbara after a brief hiatus from town. We had been traveling for a little while, and I was alone, and I was filled with anxiety. So I didn't realize what was happening to my body at the time, how the situation was impacting me. And then the mudslides happened. So I don't know if you guys are aware of what happened with the Montecito mudslides, but in the middle of the night, I believe it was early January or end of December, after rain came and the fires ended, mudslides came touring down the mountain in Montecito and killed 22 or 25 people. And that was pretty terrifying and horrific. They drown in the mud. For me, I felt like I couldn't own my emotional reaction and experience through all of this. So my friends had left, and as they came back into town, they were feeling okay and they were feeling totally fine. They didn't seem to have some sort of emotional reaction. And I was filled with fear and terror. And I wasn't a long-term Santa Barbaran. We had only lived there for a couple of years, so I didn't feel an ownership to the city. I also didn't know anybody personally. I knew somebody third hand who had been taken from the mudslides, and I didn't feel I could own any sort of emotional reaction to this. I had recurring anxiety after the fact. My husband and I were looking at homes up in the hills that were in woods, and I was sort of living some PTSD, terrified that there would be fires later on. And I couldn't even imagine living or spending money, a lot of money on a home within this neighborhood that could even be remotely affected by fires. So the reason I'm mentioning this and talking about this experience is because I want to talk about what trauma does to the body and what's happening now with COVID. Collective trauma is something that happens when everybody is experiencing the same trauma. And right now with COVID, collective trauma is commonplace in 2020. The pandemic is sweeping the globe. It's kind of out of control here in the US. and the subsequent recession and people losing their jobs, not having enough, not having health care, insidious racism, the violence and murder of people of color, what's happening with the federal government. These are all things that are extremely traumatic to individuals and collectively as society. And in regards to collective trauma, there's something called a collective neural net that we're all energetically connected to. So even if we don't know somebody who is directly affected by these things, we're just reading it on the news. That in and of itself is traumatic, but we're all having different levels of experience and different levels of trauma as related to what's happening. And so I want you to take a moment, just touch base with yourself and think about how you're being affected right now with what's happening. Close your eyes and put your hand on your heart and just feel what comes up for you when I talk about these things. Like for me, I feel some emotion around this. Yeah, it's heavy stuff. So we're going to keep talking about this, but if you join my next session, we're going to like heal it and we're going to clear it. So what I'd like to talk about now is what trauma does to the body and the mind, what trauma does to us, and then the long-term outcomes are. I've given you a little bit of like a story around it. So what happened to me with COVID, and you guys each have your own story, and I'd love to interact with you and talk to you about what's happened to you since the pandemic hit. Like when the coronavirus first hit for me, it sort of felt like gnawing anxiety crept through my body. It sort of pitched a tent, lit a campfire, and sent smoke signals through my neural pathways that screamed, we're in danger. The way I reacted was like going online and buying all the things I needed to buy, hand sanitizer, Lysol, things like that, to like feel okay and safe. Also, I was sort of numb in a sense, and I couldn't move. I was frozen. Yeah. I couldn't concentrate. I didn't know how to move forward or do anything. But not too long after that, it just sort of went away. I did start to use movement to move through it. I meditated a little bit, but movement really helped me move through it. And this is when I started to make the connection back to what happened to me in the Thomas fire. It clicked like, oh, that was trauma. And I was able to communicate it with my husband and share with him like, yeah, that was trauma that I experienced back then. He didn't even recognize it, and none of my friends did. So I'm imagining that you guys are experiencing some level of trauma right now and may or may not realize it right now, because so many people are living through traumatic experiences with what's happening in the world. You're probably aware of it on some level. So what happens with trauma? Emotional effects, typically in regards to the initial emotional reaction to the event, and it lingers. So there's sadness, anger, guilt, fear, shame, heightened anxiety. There can be a sense of hopelessness, vulnerability, guilt, a sense of isolation, heightened vigilance for new threats. You can feel vulnerable. So I want you to take a look. You have a sheet in front of you that has these listed, and write down anything that you are feeling right now around this. And you can even type it into the chat. Like, what are you experiencing right now with COVID or anything else that's happening in the chat? Like, what are you feeling and what's it related to right now? And I'm probably going to keep talking, but At the end, we will come back to this and we'll talk about all this via the chat. So other things that happen through trauma are emotional dysregulation. There's long-term dysregulation. And this is typically seen from early life childhood trauma. And then there's short-term dysregulation. Usually we see this when a well-adjusted adult experiences trauma. So maybe you're pretty well-adjusted and now you're living through COVID and it's affecting you a lot. So this looks like self-medication, addiction, substance abuse, other high-risk behaviors like driving fast, self-injurious behaviors, disordered eating or eating disorders, compulsive behaviors like gambling or overworking, repression or denial of emotions. Yeah, and I definitely had a lot of that going on back during the Thomas Fire. I was repressing what I was feeling. And then there's numbing. So what's numbing? It's a biological process where emotions become detached from thoughts, behaviors, and memories. So you don't feel anything. And so if you guys aren't feeling anything, maybe you are experiencing collective trauma right now. You just can't feel it. Maybe not. Yeah, you're completely well adjusted and this isn't affecting you, like nothing that's going on in the world. Like consider that we were all born into a world, onto a planet that is diseased. Yeah, that's in pain. And that alone is collective trauma. Intergenerational trauma is when trauma is passed from generation to generation. And if that trauma is not processed and fully digested, it stays in the collective neural net. And we all feel it on some level energetically, right? We talk about this idea of collective consciousness and raising consciousness, but this cannot fully be raised and healed unless we're healing the trauma that is in the energy field collectively. Yeah, and right now there's a lot of pain and suffering that's happening around us. So what else? Researchers have shown when trauma happens in childhood particularly, but also in adulthood, like trauma has been shown to cause chronic illness and chronic pain. How does this happen? So there's a biological shift and change when we experience trauma. Cortisol levels are changed. Like your neural connections are critically impaired. Those people whose brains were changed were shown to have more adverse health outcomes. And if left untreated, trauma will continue to tear down your system. Beyond neural connectivity, chronic stress and increased inflammation wreaks havoc on the immune system. So there's this study called the ACEs study. It has shown that 61% of adults experienced trauma in childhood. And we'll talk about exactly what the ACEs are. They lead to negative outcomes, including chronic illness as adults. Anybody who has some sort of illness or chronic pain or emotional difficulties or addiction as an adult, it's worth looking into what did you experience as a child. So let's talk about what the ACEs are. There are potentially traumatic events that occurred in childhood between the age of when you're born and the age of 17. Experiencing violence, abuse, or neglect, witnessing violence in the home or the community, having a family member attempt or die by suicide. It also has been shown that trauma can include microaggressions. So bullying, things like that. Also includes aspects of a child's environment that undermine their sense of safety, stability, and bonding, such as growing up in a household where there's substance misuse, mental health problems. So if your parent is depressed, if your parent is sick, things like that. Instability due to parental separation. So if your parent leaves for a little while. Household members being in jail or in prison. But also this type of connection between trauma and illness has been linked to things outside of the home. So any of this type of thing that's witnessed in the community with your friends. And ACEs are linked to chronic health problems, mental illness, substance abuse in adulthood. They can negatively impact education, job opportunities. The great news is they can be prevented. Also, we're here today because they can be healed. The other thing that is worth mentioning is that the cognitions related to trauma, we may not recognize it because there may be excessive or inappropriate guilt. Like I've worked with clients where their fight-flight response is so overactive and they're experiencing so much anxiety, but they're feeling so guilty because, and they make excuses for that, that they can't accept that they are experiencing PTSD and trauma, so they can't begin to heal. Also, misrepresenting a current situation is dangerous because it represents or even remotely represents a previous trauma. And I personally had that experience in the fire. My husband and I went to see a home months later, and I thought it could potentially represent a danger. Intrusive thoughts or memories without warning. This is very similar to this is what PTSD is. Trauma-induced hallucinations or delusions. That's PTSD. And I've even read experiences of people who months later, suffering from COVID, have been experiencing memories or hallucinations of not being able to breathe from COVID, and they're re-experiencing. Where does this leave us? And what does this mean for us? Buried traumas create wounds that scar us from living our best lives, from thriving, and from shining brightly inside and out. The beautiful thing about trauma is that you can make a decision to use it to heal. It's a doorway to our authentic self. We hold trauma in our bodies, and we can find it and we can catalyze it and we can awaken to our authentic selves by healing our trauma. And once we understand and accept this link between trauma and physical pain and addiction and emotional pain and chronic illness, we can live our best lives. It's a very freeing realization and understanding of the neurobiological channels and how they work inside of us and how the way trauma really impacts our physiology and how we can heal it. And this is why somatic work is so powerful, because it calms the nervous system. It shuts down the fight-flight response that doesn't need to be continuously working. Yeah, and the type of work that I do, it's different than other somatic work, which is why I call it the Truth Catalyst method. It is my own version, and it allows us to peer inside and connect with the memories we hold on a cellular level and heal them and shift them into an empowered state. We're going to use the rest of this session to talk about what we're all experiencing right now, how we are affected by the collective experience, and we're going to do that through the chat. And then during next session, we're going to take a somatic journey and actually heal what's happening. So what I'd like you to do, I want you to take a look at this sheet and see what I've written down, and then type into the chat where you're being affected in your body. Yeah.